My name is Jim Sullivan. I'm the director of the Bennington County Regional Commission, and I wanted to first thank Arlington High School for hosting this event. It's a beautiful facility here, and especially recognize Madison Kramer. Madison, wave. Thank you very much. We've been doing energy work and energy planning at the Regional Commission for quite a while, as many of you know. And we're fortunate to be starting a new round where we're really going to be trying to work on helping towns implement their energy plans and indeed our regional energy plan. And that's an effort really that's Efficiency Vermont has really stepped up in supporting all the regional commissions around the state. So we're just getting started, and I guess this would be like our inaugural event on that, and so I think it's a great way to get started. Before I introduce our speaker, because I always have to make some pithy remark at the beginning of these things, right? So, but I want to say I just returned from a 2-week vacation in the Netherlands, and it was nice. Yeah, but setting aside a moment the fact that flying to Europe for my summer vacation was probably not terribly beneficial to the planet, I did make some interesting observations while I was over there. First, energy and climate change related. So this is relevant, folks. This isn't like my vacation story. So see my vacation slides, right? But I tell you, the first thing that struck me is I was over there largely for a biking vacation, but the bicycling culture over there is absolutely phenomenal, as many of you might know. That is, bicycles are the way to get around in the Netherlands, and if you go a little further than is convenient by bike, you go by public transportation, and somewhere way down on the list of priorities are like automobiles. They're there, but even the cars, there's a lot of electric cars, and there's a lot of electric car charging infrastructure for not only for cars but for e-bikes. I saw public e-bike charging stations in the Netherlands. So I was impressed with that. I was certainly impressed as a long-time land use planner with the historical compact mixed-use development pattern, which makes for very walkable, efficient communities. Outside, obviously, the abundance of local agriculture and some absolutely beautiful community gardens. And very obviously, in a country that was quite literally built by wind energy, the legacy of that wind energy is still very much in evidence with offshore and onshore wind energy farms, and you also see a lot that's balanced with a lot of solar development on just about every large south-facing rooftop I saw. So I was like struck. I was like, man, these folks are doing it right, and in a lot of ways they are. But I got back and I read an article that about 886 Netherlands residents sued the Dutch government for not doing enough to address climate change and reduce greenhouse gas emissions, and they won the lawsuit. So I was like, wow, they're doing all that, and they are not doing enough. And you know what? They're right. They're probably not doing enough, and which kind of shines a light on where we are in this country, because we're a little ways behind them, to be sure. So certainly more needs to be done, and we I think as citizens of the country and our communities, we need to understand why it's so critical that we take action, and we need to remind ourselves of that, and we need to really care enough to do more than just be concerned about it and talk about it. We need to care enough to really make changes in our own lives and to motivate change in our communities. So that said, we are, I think, very fortunate today to have somebody who can really shine a light on just why it is so important to make those changes and to drive that change at a local, level to ultimately affect change throughout our state and our country. So Dr. Edward Cameron, who I understand many of you have met before, but Dr. Cameron is a global climate change advocate with many years of experience working with the EU and other international organizations to support bold actions toward the pursuit of a low-carbon, climate-resilient, and inclusive global economy. He's worked with governments around the world, designed climate leadership plans, developed engagement strategies, and many countries and organizations have, as I said, benefited from his work to strengthen environmental and climate policies. Most recently, he developed policy for worldwide coalition shaping private sector advocacy in the design of the landmark Paris Climate Agreement. I think most importantly, right, I understand that his wife is a native Vermonter. And consequently, he's moved to Manchester, Vermont, and so he's also a neighbor. So with that...
She can't claim 10 generations back, though, so she's still a flatlander, technically.
Okay, so she may be a flatlander, but she is... you folks are living in Manchester. So with that, I'd like to welcome Dr. Cameron. Thank you.
Thank you. Good evening, everybody. Can I first of all ask whose phone went off a few moments ago? Do you know how intimidating it is to come up here after I've heard I can't get no satisfaction? So I'm hoping I can give you some satisfaction during the course of the next 90 minutes or so. Let's see where we land. I want to first and foremost thank you all for giving up your evening to come and participate in what I hope will be a conversation, not just a one-way flow of information, because the purpose of tonight is to build our collective capacity to work on this issue of climate change, and that means not only availing of what I have learned working on this issue for over 2 decades, but also availing of what you have learned living in this community, contributing to this community, and of course through the wealth of professional experience that each of you bring to this conversation. I want to start by saying that I bring a very particular viewpoint to the topic of climate change, and that I don't believe that this is a conversation exclusively about the coming apocalypse. I think this is a conversation about how we use this inflection point in time to build a better world. And B, if we spend the next 15 years reducing greenhouse gas emissions to the point where we eliminate climate risk, and if we spend the next 15 years building societal and ecological resilience to the point where adaptive capacity in the face of climate extremes is increased, but we still hand over a world with rampant inequality, where social mobility has broken down, where there are between 60 million and 100 million disappeared women around the world, where 22,000 children die of hunger every single day, then what will we have spent our time on, and for what end? So what I'm talking about in this presentation is not just how we go about settling the atmosphere in terms of its chemical composition once again. What I'm talking about is how do we use the next 15 years to build a better world, a more inclusive politics, a more shared prosperity, social systems that are robust, tackling structural discrimination, and of course ensuring that we have environmental sustainability. So you'll see those 2 major themes running throughout the conversation this evening. What I'm going to try to do is focus on 4 different segments, if you will, 4 different elements to the conversation that we're going to have. First and foremost, I'm going to talk about climate risk, and specifically how we might improve our understanding of climate risk. Because if you do not properly diagnose a problem, you cannot hope to solve that problem. Second of all, I'm going to talk about the solutions. And the main point I'm going to emphasize is we do not have to wait for any innovation or silver bullet in the form of technology in order to manage and solve this problem. The solutions we need are available to us now. The question is, do we have the creativity, the imagination, the political will, the political courage to actually draw down on those solutions, to use a phrase pioneered recently by Paul Hawken and colleagues. Third, I'm going to talk about the American experience, and there we're going to get political. We're going to talk about what's happening at the federal level, but we're also going to talk about what's happening here in Vermont. And we're going to ask, do we have sufficient leadership nationally and within the state? to make this reality of a better world come to fruition? And if not, what do we need to do about our political environment? And then finally, I'm going to talk about what we can do to lead the transition to this low-carbon, climate-resilient and inclusive economy. Particularly, I'm going to talk about what we can do as a community. So when it comes to town planning, municipal planning, regional planning, what are the types of steps that we should put in place? What is the type of architecture we should be using? But then, what are the types of steps that we should be pursuing as individuals? Because bold collective action starts with individual commitment. So we're going to be talking about that. I have to apologize in advance to the numerous people in the room who have heard me speak before, because some of this will seem repetitive. I have personally seen the movie Star Wars 1,200 times, so I quite like the idea of watching things repeatedly, but some of you will have heard much of this before, so apologies in advance. Okay, so we're going to start with a conversation on climate risk. And I always like to use this image to remind myself that we have been extremely complacent on this issue for far too long. It was President Lyndon Johnson who received the first ever climate report from scientists in 1965. And we have had moments of boom and bust when it comes to climate leadership over the course of the subsequent 54 years. But too often what we have done is we have thought about climate change as tomorrow's problem happening to people living in a distant land. And we haven't been wise enough to realize that this is an issue that affects all of us and that it affects all of us today. So what I want to try to do very quickly is first and foremost bring you up to speed on what the best science on this issue actually says. I want to try to give you an overview of how climate change is impacting the world we live in today. And I want to try and help you properly diagnose climate risk so that we have a common foundation for how we go about talking about potential solutions. Now, as I always say, the best available science on this issue is brought together through cycles, 7-year cycles, organized by something called the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. This is a global body that reviews all the peer-reviewed published science on climate change with experts drawn from all around the world. And their last major report was in 2014. They've had some minor reports since then, including the notable 1.5 degree report. And their next major cycle of reviewing the climate science will be in 2021. The last cycle was more than 4,000 pages of science. And what I want to do is to boil that down for you into 4 words that you can take away at the end of this evening. So the first word is unequivocal. What that means is that climate change is real. It is not a Chinese hoax. It is not a liberal conspiracy. It is not the invention of a documentary by Al Gore. It is absolutely real. It is evident through observation, and it's also evident through all the scientific data that we can accumulate in a variety of forms, meaning that the scientific method has examined, concluded, validated the fact that climate change is real. Second of all, it is urgent, and in addition to being urgent, it is accelerating, meaning we have first and foremost a limited time frame available to us by which time we must avoid, quote, dangerous climate change. Now, for many years, scientists identified dangerous climate change as being global mean temperature rises above 2 degrees Celsius relative to pre-industrial temperatures. More recently, we've begun to understand that actually we need to hold temperatures below 1.5 degrees Celsius. That is an enormous challenge because we've already seen global mean temperature rises in excess of 1 degree Celsius since the dawn of the industrial age. So it is now projected that we essentially have until the end of the next decade, by which time we need to have peaked and dramatically reduced greenhouse gases through both sources of those gases, but also sinks such as the oceans, the soil, land use, and so on. We say that it is accelerating because the longer we delay in addressing this issue, the more pronounced the problem becomes. So, for example, as global mean temperatures rise, we see a dramatic decrease in the amount of Arctic sea ice. We see Arctic sea ice disappearing in the summer, for example. That's really important because Arctic sea ice reflects heat and radiation and light back into outer space. And when that Arctic sea ice disappears, instead of being reflected into outer space, the heat is absorbed by the ocean, and consequently the process of global warming accelerates. Third, it is human. meaning climate change is not caused by solar variations or solar flares or volcanic activity or tectonic plates moving. It's caused by human systems creating pollution derived from human activities. It's caused by our energy use, notably our dependence on fossil fuels. It's caused by land use, whether that is the destruction of our forests or the way in which we have created massive agricultural systems. It is caused by our mobility and transport patterns. It is caused by a range of human activities that cumulatively create greenhouse gas pollution and send that pollution into the atmosphere, which in turn changes the chemical composition of the atmosphere. And finally, it is solvable. One of the major and most important elements of this debate that is often lost is that if we get busy now, we have all of the means available to us in order for us to reduce risk, manage the risk that remains, and transition to a world that is low carbon, climate resilient, inclusive, that is a world of greater job creation, that is a world of shared economic development, that provides equitable access to sustainable development, even for the most marginalized and vulnerable right around the world. Now, during the course of the last 2 years, we have unfortunately seen climate change come home to roost right across the globe. And I want to pinpoint a couple of examples that not only illustrate the climate impacts themselves, but illustrate different dimensions to climate change that we really must begin to note. The interface, if you will, between the ecological consequences of climate change and the human systems upon which we all depend. So if you look right over here, the Western United States, you will know, of course, that they have suffered an enormous number of wildfires. In fact, the most damaging wildfires have happened in California over the course of the last 20 years. But of course, we've had the Mendocino and the Camp Fire complex fires in California recently over the course of the last 18 months. Now, in addition to causing economic damage and human tragedy, one of the interesting parts of the wildfires in California is that it led to the collapse of PG&E, one of the largest power utilities in the nation. And the reason that that happened is because they were found to be complicit and even liable for the start of the wildfires. The reason I raise that as a point is because increasingly right around the world, whether you are a government or whether you are a company, people are beginning to hold you accountable for failure to lead on the issue of climate change. And that becomes a powerful motivating factor whether you're an elected official or sitting in a C-suite in a corporation somewhere. Further over, if we start looking at the eastern seaboard of the United States, we saw in the Atlantic hurricane season of 2017, $290 billion of damages. Think of the amount of healthcare, infrastructure, education, economic development, poverty alleviation that could have been bought with $290 billion if we had not wasted that money avoiding climate risk. Similarly, of course, we saw tragically 3,000 premature deaths on the island of Puerto Rico. As I've always said when I've spoken publicly before, it's a mistake to compare and contrast different tragedies, but I always note the similarity in terms of the number of fatalities with those who died on 9/11, simply to pinpoint that there is a vast difference between the mobilization of national and global resources in response to one tragedy and the vision of President Trump distributing paper towels in Puerto Rico. And that is because we are not serious enough about this challenge, and we are not mobilizing our capacity to the necessary conditions in order to respond to the challenge. What I also want to pinpoint on the eastern seaboard are the hurricanes that happened in 2018, Hurricanes Michael and Hurricanes Florence, which impacted the Carolinas. Now, the reason why they're important is because unlike previous hurricanes, they were not fast moving and they were not fast spinning, and they did not cause wind damage. They were slow moving, they were slow spinning, they labored over land for a long time, and the damage they caused was flood damage. And the reason that's important is because while many Americans in that part of the world have wind insurance, only 14% of Americans have flood insurance, which means we're not only seeing an increase in the intensity and frequency of extreme weather events, we're seeing the nature of those weather events changing, and our human systems are not keeping up with those changes in ecological patterns. Right across this particular region and right across the country, we see a rise in vector and waterborne diseases, notably, of course, tick-borne diseases like Lyme's disease. There are now more than 300,000 Americans who annually report that they have contracted Lyme disease, which can be debilitating for an individual, devastating for a household and a community. If you continue to look right across the world, you'll see that there are parts of the world who have suffered extreme events who are not nearly as well equipped as the United States to respond and rebuild after those events. So down on the southern tip of Africa, you have Mozambique, which suffered not one but two major cyclones in the course of 1 month earlier this year, literally wiping towns off the face of the map. And recently we saw record temperatures reached in France, and the science has already concluded, the attribution science has already concluded, that 4 degrees Celsius was added to that temperature record directly as a consequence of climate change. So this is something that is happening around the world. It is something that is increasing in intensity, and it's something that is putting enormous stress on human systems. It, of course, also has global implications in terms of its threat to economic development. So global economic assessments have suggested that climate will threaten somewhere between 2 and 4, this should be actually $1 trillion by 2030, and some of the estimates are as high as $24 trillion. Now, to put that into perspective, the global economy is worth somewhere between $70 and $90 trillion. So you're talking about 1/3 approximately of global assets being directly at risk as a consequence of climate extremes. And you also see some very specific threats in some very fragile parts of the world. So the final part of this particular slide indicates the threat to fresh water systems around the Himalayas. And when you think of the state fragility and the history of conflict in that region, when you combine that with the fact that 50 million Bangladeshis are living below sea level, and the only place that they have to migrate to when it becomes necessary is into northeastern India, where there is a history of intercommunal violence between Muslim and Hindu populations. And when you consider that many of these countries are nuclear armed and politically unstable, you can see that we're not just talking about environmental danger. We're talking about societal fragility, human systems, combining with ecological degradation to lead to amplified risk. Now, one of the things I always try to educate people on is how we must go about developing a three-dimensional understanding of what it is that we're facing. And what I mean by 3 dimensions is that climate risk is composed of 3 elements. The first is the hazard. So, for example, if a hurricane forms in the mid-Atlantic, that is your hazard. But if it never makes landfall, we don't really have to worry about it. Then the second dimension comes into play, which is exposure. Meaning if you have put in place really bad planning processes in Florida, where you are having facilities and utilities and population centers and infrastructure in places where those things should not be going, then you have the second problem. You have exposure. You have opened yourself up and put yourself in the path of that extreme weather event. But quite often the missing third dimension is the one that's most important of all, and that is the issue of vulnerability. Do we have any underlying weaknesses that exacerbate the exposure to the hazard? So, for example, Superstorm Sandy hit New York in 2012. There was an inundation of salt water, seawater intrusion right across lower Manhattan. One telecommunications company, Verizon, had copper cabling. All of the competitors had fiber optic cabling. Copper wire disintegrates in seawater. So Verizon lost $1 billion. They lost connectivity. They lost reputation. They lost customers because they had an underlying weakness that they had not properly assessed when conducting their risk assessments. But if we look at society, we'll see that there are also underlying weaknesses right across our societies that we often fail to ignore. And the simple reality is, if you are from a marginalized community, perhaps you are a member of an indigenous population, perhaps you are a member of a low-income population, perhaps you are a person of color, perhaps you are disabled, perhaps you are elderly, or perhaps you are a woman. If you are amongst one of these marginalized groups, then you suffer what's called asymmetrical impacts. So I've always said that the most important statistic that motivated my career in climate change is the one that says 90% of all fatalities to extreme weather events in Bangladesh in the 1991 cyclone were women. That's not because the women were exposed to a hazard that the men were not exposed to. It's because they could not leave home without a male guardian. They had never been taught how to climb a tree. They had never been taught how to swim. They did not feel confident that the disaster shelters they would relocate to would be disaster shelters that would respect their cultural beliefs. They did not feel that they had appropriate clothing that would enable them to mingle with the men in a disaster shelter. They did not have access to information, therefore they did not know when the storm was coming. They did not have access to decision making, therefore they could not sit with their municipality and put in place resilient strategies that accounted for their vulnerability. They did not have access to justice, so unlike our Dutch colleagues, they were not able to sue anybody. They did not have access to financial services, no savings, no credit lines, no ability to inherit property from their spouse when their spouse died. Consequently, many of them were unable to rebuild shattered lives after the storm had passed. So what this example tells us is that climate change is not about weather events and environment, it's about the interplay between those things and structural discrimination in our societies. Cultural, social, political, legal, and economic discrimination. Which means if you want to take seriously climate risk, you have to understand that, and if you want to be an advocate for climate resilience, you have to be willing to speak out on the issue of human rights. Because it is the lack of human rights that makes people vulnerable, and it's strengthening human rights that gives people all of the tools that they need to advocate, to account for their lived experience, to push government and companies and other stakeholders towards greater resilience. Okay, that's all the negative stuff out of the way, so now let's get to the positive stuff, which is that this is a moment where we can either wallow in climate change or we can focus on the chance we now have before us to build a better world. So I want to concentrate on a couple of things. The first is, for those of you who have not already read it, I strongly recommend that you buy Project Drawdown, a new book edited by Paul Hawken, but with contributions from the leading thinkers on climate mitigation right around the world. And I stress climate mitigation because this is a book not about how you build an inclusive world, not about how you build resilience, but exclusively about how you reduce greenhouse gases. It's a book that contains over 80 different proposals that can be worked on together or individually. These span all manner of sectors within our economy, including the most important ones such as energy, transport, and land use, including agriculture. The important message to take from this is that every single recommendation in this book is not dependent on a fantasy technological solution. All of these 80 measures are currently in play, are being used right around the world. So whether we're talking about wind turbines, offshore or onshore, whether we're talking about solar on your rooftop or in solar farms, whether we're talking about energy efficiency, whether we're talking about geothermal, whether we're talking about regenerative agriculture, whether we're talking about addressing livestock, whether we're talking about public transport or electronic vehicles. All of these things are already working in a cost-effective way somewhere in the world right now. And some of them are working at tremendous scale. So for a state like this or a community like this, you don't have to reinvent the wheel, you just have to be smart enough to copy the right people. The other thing I would say is if you are going to go out and buy this book, please buy it from the Northshire bookstore and not from Amazon, because we have to minimize our own carbon footprint, and that's one of the ways to do it. One of the very important things to remember when you're reading Project Drawdown, and in particular here I focused on renewable energy, is that when you adopt these solutions, when you invest in these solutions, you're not just investing in tackling climate change, you're also investing in cleaner air. And 200,000 Americans die every year prematurely as a consequence of air pollution. And 9 million people die premature deaths around the world every year from air pollution. That is 16% of all the premature deaths that happen around the world on an annual basis. So this is an investment in healthcare. This is an investment in longevity, but it's also an investment in economic development. It's an investment in job creation. Because as this slide illustrates, jobs in the renewable energy sector are growing 12 times faster than job creation in the rest of the economy. We also see that the number of jobs in the renewable and clean energy sector more broadly is growing and substantial already. And we see that the alternative, which is investing in a 19th century energy system rather than a 21st century energy system, doesn't really yield the economic benefits anyway, because the jobs in coal, for example, have been collapsing since the 1970s anyway. And they haven't been collapsing because of climate policy. There has been no war on coal. They've been collapsing because it's simply not cost competitive to pull coal out of strange places anymore. And it's cheaper to employ a machine to go after that coal than it is to employ a coal worker from West Virginia. So these jobs are going. There's nothing we can do about that. What we can do, however, is we can invest in what's called a just transition. We can make sure that as we build this new clean energy economy, that we are investing in reskilling, retooling, that we are not leaving individuals and communities behind, not only because it is the right thing to do to take them on this journey to a new climate economy, but also because if you don't take them with you, you end up with a populist backlash. So it is very important to understand that this job creation and this economic development is possible, but it's also necessary that it be a shared prosperity. One of my favorite statistics that really rams home the importance of this point in the Vermont context is the fact that when you spend money on fossil fuels in Vermont, 78 cents out of every dollar leaves the state. Whereas when you spend money on renewable energy in Vermont, much more of that money stays here for the people who are going to put up the wind turbines, the people who are going to weatherize your home, the people who are investing in solar and putting the solar on your family homes and on your businesses. So again, switching from fossil fuels to renewables is an investment in tackling climate change, but it's also an investment in your neighbours. It's an investment in making sure that the tax base of Vermont does not continue to shrink. It's an investment in making sure that the young people of Vermont can stay here and get a job and not have to move away from the state in search of employment. Second major hope for optimism, beyond the fact that the solutions are available, is that governments around the world have actually begun to act. And they have started to put in place the foundations for this low-carbon, climate-resilient and inclusive economy. The Paris Agreement is what currently provides us with that foundation. And again, it is a very long document. It is a process that was 23 years in the making. So rather than tell you the full story, I want to give you 5 words to help you digest and understand the Paris Agreement. The first is that the agreement is unprecedented, both in terms of participation, but also in terms of ambition. There are 196 countries around the world who have signed the Paris Agreement. 189 of them already have national climate action plans. China, for example, National Climate Action Plan, and I'll tell you about that in just a moment. Of those 196 countries, only one has suggested that it wants to leave the Paris Agreement. Now, when you think of 195 countries, you're not thinking about progressive liberal Democrats. You're thinking about the theocrats of Iran, the communists/capitalists of China, whatever the government in North Korea happens to be. You're thinking about socialists in France and Christian Democrats in Germany. You're thinking about conservatives in the United Kingdom. No matter where you fall on the political spectrum between left and right, your government around the world has signed up to this agreement, meaning your government has accepted the science, your government is investing in the transition, your government believes that the economy we're trying to create is better than the economy we have. Which begs the question, why don't we have that same bipartisan understanding of the issue in this country? And we will get to that. But it's also unprecedented in terms of ambition, because before the Paris Agreement was signed, we were on course for 4.3 degrees Celsius of temperature rises before the end of this century. And to put that into context, the basic crops we depend upon for food security, wheat and maize, corn and rice, they cannot grow at those temperatures. So what do you do if by the end of this century, population has gone beyond 10 billion, it was 3 billion when I was born, and at the same time, the basic staples that we depend upon for food security can no longer grow? Well, that's when you have the apocalypse. But as a consequence of the Paris Agreement, we're now on course for about 2.8 degrees Celsius of temperature rises. Nowhere near good enough, but within that space, between 4.3 and 2.8, a whole new economy is being built. And the question is, are we going to have the sophistication and the intelligence to seize the opportunity of that new economy? Second of all, it is defining in its impact. It is a mistake to think of the Paris Agreement as an environmental diplomatic triumph. It is more appropriate to think of the Paris Agreement as a global economic stimulus, because within those 189 national climate action plans, there is $13 trillion of investments in clean energy in the next decade alone. And when you add all of the investments in urbanization, industrialization, transportation, agriculture and land use, you're talking about tens of trillions of dollars of new investments over the course of the next decade. In China alone, they are going to source 20% of all of their energy from renewable sources by the end of the next decade, which is the equivalent of all of the electricity generation in the United States today. And in order to meet that goal, they're mobilizing finance that is the modern equivalent of the Marshall Plan, which was used to reconstruct Europe after the Second World War. Because they're doing this, they're creating millions of jobs in clean energy, and they're now home to the largest renewable energy companies in the world, because they're smart enough to understand what it means to be a 21st century energy superpower, as opposed to what it means to look 100 years into the past. What I want to tell you is that it's also elastic, however, meaning that this agreement can go backwards if more countries follow the model that has been set, the precedent that has been set by the federal government in Washington. But it also, baked into its architecture, has the capacity to go further faster. One of the most important elements of the Paris Agreement is that it has a clause that says we will progressively increase ambition over time, which means the national plans adopted in 2015 are going to be renegotiated next year and every 5 years after that. And within each 5-year cycle, governments have committed to come back on each occasion and raise their level of commitment. And then finally, the Paris Agreement is incomplete. It is a foundation only, and it's up to all of us as individuals, it's up to all of us as towns and cities and states and provinces and countries to continue the journey and build on the foundation that has been given to us by the Paris Agreement. And now the third reason to be optimistic. When I started working on this issue in 1997, I considered the private sector to be hostile to everything I wanted to achieve when it came to environmental policy. The only time I would ever hear from a company is when they wanted to dilute, undermine, or scrap anything that I was trying to do on environmental policy. But something fundamental shifted during the course of the first part of this decade. What happened was that companies began to realize that climate change was a risk to their operations, a risk to their profits, a risk to their reputation, a risk to their strategies. If you're an oil and gas company, you now have stranded assets, which means all that money you've paid to own oil reserves might actually go down the tubes if you're not able to take the oil out of the ground. A risk to your human resources, because you might face worker liability issues from climate impacts. And you might fail to recruit the best talent, because millennials want to work for companies that have a sense of purpose and a sense of mission and the right values. So first and foremost, companies began to understand the risk of inaction. But second of all, they began to understand the opportunities of leading on this particular issue. They began to understand that shareholders and investors would begin to flock to them, that consumers would begin to buy from them, that avoiding supply chain disruption by managing risk in the supply chain would give competitive advantage over peers and rivals. So what we see is not altruism or philanthropy. What we see is a cold, clear-eyed calculation of risk and opportunity that has now led to 6,000 companies around the world who together represent half the global economy making climate commitments. And these climate commitments are significant. The companies listed on this particular slide have made what are called science-based targets. What that means is that they are taking on board their fair share of what it means to hold temperatures to 2 degrees Celsius or less. They're now revising those targets to make sure that they're in line with 1.5 degrees Celsius. And if you take an example on this screen, Walmart, which is the one that I always like to use, when Walmart acts, others are obliged to follow, because Walmart is responsible for 11% of all Chinese imports into the United States. One company, 11%. So when the CEO of Walmart decides that the price of doing business with Walmart is low carbon and not just low cost, then his suppliers in China have to react to that. Walmart also has 100,000 suppliers in the United States. They have to react to that. And there's an anecdote that when the CEO of Coca-Cola found out about what Walmart was doing at noon, he insisted that his own marketing department must have a press release ready by 5 p.m. same day saying that Coca-Cola would respond in kind. When you have a major anchor, whether in government, at the state level, as we see with California, or in the corporate sector, deciding to take a leadership position, others begin to follow. The second major commitment area that we see in the private sector is a commitment to purchase 100% of their energy from renewable sources. This is the reason why the current administration's attempts to undermine renewable energy and to return to a 19th century energy system will not work, because these companies have already come out and are joining forces to purchase renewable energy. So even if you raise the tariffs on the commodities that are necessary for renewable energy, and even if you scrap the coal clean power plan, you still have market signals coming from the largest companies and the dominant sectors in the economy saying we want to purchase renewable energy. But there's a second very important story on this slide that Vermont really needs to take account of. And that is that these companies are now making investment, job creation, and location decisions based on their ability to procure renewable energy. So if you're Facebook and you have a data center in Alabama, and the only option available to you is a monopoly energy provider providing you with fossil fuel, and if the zoning authorities in Alabama tell you that you cannot create your own on-site renewable energy, then Facebook right now is saying to Alabama, okay, well, sorry, we're leaving. And the reason we're leaving is because we have made a commitment to our shareholders in the case of many of these companies. We have to, by fiduciary responsibility, honor those commitments, and therefore we're going to relocate to a state or province that can provide us with the means to meet these targets. The one place that I've seen that's seizing on this is Quebec. Quebec is actively going out to all of these companies and saying, we can give you all the renewable energy you need, bring your jobs, bring your investment, bring the economic opportunities to our province. Why doesn't Vermont have a climate commissioner? Why doesn't Vermont have a climate ambassador whose sole job is to go out to these companies and to bring them to this state? Maybe not the ones we dislike, but there's enough companies on this slide that we do like who, again, would be able to help us with a shrinking tax base and the retention of our young people and generate the revenues that we need to tackle the economic and social problems in the state. Okay, the American experience. Now, I should warn you in advance that I'm Irish, therefore I'm neither Democrat nor Liberal, but if you are a Trump supporter, the next slide might not make you happy. Now, I, of course, like anybody else in the world, have viewpoints about President Trump, but I'm not here to comment on his policy agenda writ large. I'm not here to comment on his moral character, and I would never dream of commenting on his voters, because it's one thing to be the man, it's another thing to have voted for the man, and there's all manner of legitimate reasons for why people voted for President Trump. What I am here to do is to comment on his climate policies, and to do it in a way that is, again, clear-eyed and fact-based. President Obama put in place a whole series of climate policies. For my money, he did it far too late. He squandered the first term, if not the first 6 years of his administration. When there was an emissions trading plan ready to be adopted in Congress, he did not put his shoulder to the wheel. He left Nancy Pelosi to do it alone, and she fell just short. But there has been a succession of policies put in place over the course of the last 16 years or so that began to move the needle on this issue. Now, President Trump is undermining this in all manner of ways, some of which are obvious, some of which are less obvious, but actually more important. So, for example, he has put in place personnel right across the federal government that are climate deniers, science deniers, and whose careers have been built taking money from oil and gas and coal. These are just a series of the names. Myron Ebel, for example, was in charge of the transition team that put in place the senior staff at the Environmental Protection Agency, a man that built his career, paid for by the Koch brothers to question climate science. Andrew Wheeler, current EPA administrator, the same thing. Scott Pruitt made his name suing the EPA for using the mandate of the Clean Air Act to regulate greenhouse gases as a pollutant. We could go on and on throughout the top tier and even the tiers below of the political appointments that are within the administration. And this is problematic because there's an old adage in Washington that personnel is policy. If you don't have a professional civil service like many European countries have, then there is more likely to be a cycle of boom and bust, because the president appoints about 6,000 staff to every new administration. Second, of course, he has shifted the terms of debate. We had reached the point, even under the Bush administration, where they didn't do anything on climate change, but they weren't silly enough to come out and dispute the science. They just slow-walked everything that they tried to do. But what the president has done is he has tried to undermine the scientific consensus step by step by step by step. And what's worrying about this is that he and his children famously wrote a letter to President Obama in 2009 demanding greater American leadership on the issue of climate change. He famously submitted articles and paperwork to the Irish government demanding that the Irish government invest in, quote, climate resilience to protect his golf courses. So it's not that he doesn't know about this issue, it's that he has made a deliberate decision that he is going to undermine public debate. Now, if you start by accepting the science, that doesn't mean we have to agree with how we treat the problem. One person might think we correct the problem by prohibiting fossil fuels. Another person might think the way to go about solving this is a government policy. Somebody else might think it all needs to be done by the market. Somebody else might think it all should be done based on voluntary commitments. There's plenty of room for us to have legitimate political, ideological discord and disagreement about the solution. But we have to start with a common acceptance of facts, because if you don't start there, it's impossible to move forward. Damage to diplomacy, of course, not only because of his threat to withdraw from the Paris Agreement, but because, for example, he submitted a budget to Congress that restricted Congress's ability to provide overseas aid to countries that want to decarbonize, and he refused to pay the American levy to the Green Climate Fund, which is the lubricant that holds the Paris Agreement together. But perhaps the most damaging part of what the president has done, which is the part that climate and environmental activists ignore, is he is changing the composition of the federal courts. Now, if you look at everything that President Obama did, it was all based on executive order. An executive order stems from Massachusetts versus EPA, a court case from 2007, which said that the federal government is obliged to regulate greenhouse gases as a pollutant under the Clean Air Act. That passed the Supreme Court in a 5-4 vote. If you pack the federal judiciary, and if you change the composition of the Supreme Court with nominees who are opposed to science, opposed to environmental stewardship, opposed to climate action, then it's perfectly possible that that court case will be overruled. And if that happens, not only do we have one president failing to act on this issue, but we restrict the capacity of any future president to act on this issue. So if you are a climate activist, you have got to keep your eye on the most important issues and not just be drawn like a moth to the latest protest about the latest tweet. And one of the things that we have failed to do as a movement is we have failed to understand power, how it works, and what's actually going on in Washington as opposed to what we might be seeing on the nightly news. Now, more broadly, one of the things that we need to do if we are to correct this is we need to go about the business of building a societal consensus. So I mentioned earlier that I might in my quieter moments be a critic of President Trump, but I would never be a critic of the voting population at large, mostly because you should never criticize the voters. But I would say that it's important to think about those who are not on the side of climate action as consisting of a number of different categories so that we can approach those different categories in a nuanced way. So first of all, there are people in this country who are uninformed. They have never been exposed to this information. And when people from my community, the climate science community, have gone to speak to them, we have spoken in jargon, we have spoken in acronyms, we have given information that is inaccessible. We have not communicated effectively, and as a consequence, many people are simply not informed on this issue. We must conduct outreach to those people. We must make the arguments real. We must make the narrative resonate. We must make the information accessible. We must educate. Second category of people are those who are misinformed. They're the people who are turning on websites or news channels that are providing them with information, but it's the wrong information. It's information that suggests that there is a debate in the science. 97% of all the peer-reviewed published science agrees that climate change is real, accelerating, and human-induced. And yet, if you turn on the nightly news, you might get one talking head arguing against one other talking head. You might get one scientist arguing against someone from the American Enterprise Institute who isn't even a scientist. And that creates the impression that there is a debate, that there is discord, that this is not settled science. These people are misinformed. Once again, we need outreach, compassion, an attempt to convert them, not an approach that points a finger at them. There's then a third group of people. These are often elected officials that are squeezed out. So one anecdote that I often tell is about a candidate for the presidency from 2016 who asked for a briefing on climate science, insisted that the briefer must come from his state, and peppered the people briefing him for about 3 to 4 hours asking about 100 questions on climate science. And at the end of the briefing, the scientist said to him, "Do you get this issue?" And he said, "Yes, I get this issue." And they said, "Are you going to lead on this issue?" And he said, "No way, I'm not going to lead on this issue." And they said, "Well, why are you not going to lead on this issue? It's so fundamentally important to you and to your state." And he said, "Well, because I have no constituency for this issue. If I come out in favor of this, the people to my right will call me a traitor, and the people to my left will call me a flip-flopper." And then he said something I will never forget. He said, "When people like me step out on the branch, people like you shake the tree." Meaning there's a lot of people who don't feel that they have a safe space to come out and lead on this issue. So we have to give them that safe space to come out and lead on this issue. We have to be ready to embrace those people who are willing to convert from a previous opinion and who are now ready to take on a leadership role. And then finally, there's a group of people who are simply misleading. Whether those are people in the Cato Institute, the American Enterprise Institute, whether they are, for example, the people of the Heartland Institute, who recently sent out a free science textbook to every public school teacher in the United States that disputes the science of climate change, knowing full well that many public school teachers do not have science resources in the classroom, knowing full well that many of them actually dip into their own pockets to buy science research in order to educate their students. These people should not be embraced. They should not be converted. They are not the subject of our compassion. These people need to be defeated. And they need to be defeated by people who have the courage to call them out for what they do and to go toe-to-toe with them and do battle with them. Because unless we get rid of these people, unless we crowd them out of the political debate, they will continue to poison our political debate. Now, let's talk quickly about Vermont. I'm going to go through this quite quickly because there's only a couple of points that I really want to make. The first is, it is extremely important and welcome that Vermont wants to be a leader on this particular issue. But how you go about leading on this issue is actually very, very important. So I've spoken to a series of lawmakers in Montpelier, and I started by asking them a question. Do you want to reduce greenhouse gas emissions in Vermont? Or do you want to contribute to global decarbonization? Or do you want to build a low-carbon, climate-resilient and inclusive economy? And most of the lawmakers said, well, that's all just 3 ways of asking the same question. And it's not 3 ways of asking the same question. They are fundamentally different things, because you in Vermont, you could concentrate on reducing the emissions of Vermont. That would be a good thing to do, but as you see on this slide, Vermont already has the lowest absolute emissions of any state in the nation, already has the lowest emissions to GDP ratio, and so on and so forth. So if all you do is concentrate on moving the needle by 1 or 2 percentage points on your own emissions, you're not really contributing to solving the problem. If, however, you take a more creative, a more imaginative, a more global understanding of the role you can play, you can do things that are really, really, really serious. So for example, earlier I mentioned Massachusetts versus EPA. That not only changed the landscape in the United States by allowing executive orders, but it provided President Obama with the credibility to go overseas and negotiate the Paris Agreement. There would be no Paris Agreement without American leadership. There would be no American leadership without Massachusetts versus EPA. And as this slide demonstrates, there would be no Massachusetts versus EPA if Vermont and other states had not joined in that lawsuit. Similarly, to his credit, the governor came out recently and confirmed once again that Vermont will retain its alignment with the California Air Standards Board in terms of fuel efficiency for vehicles sold in Vermont, counter to what the federal government is doing, which is trying to roll back the CAFE standards that were agreed some years ago. Thirdly, in addition to doing things like that, Vermont could actually begin to take steps in modelling the societal consensus that we need in order to make sure that we don't just have a 40% part of the population that's committed to this issue, but that we actually have the bulk of the population committed to this issue, making sure that we do not continue with these cycles of boom and bust. This is my last slide on Vermont, and it's blank, because it's an open question. Does Vermont have necessary leadership to innovate and invest? I have mixed feelings about this. On the one hand, for example, I give credit to the governor for what he's recently done on fuel efficiency standards. On the other hand, the governor set up a Vermont Climate Commission. And during the whole work of that commission, the governor only met with the commission once. In addition, the 53 recommendations that came out of that Climate Commission have been stalled, in part by the inaction within the governor's own office. In addition to that, he has not used budgetary discretion at his disposal to, for example, accelerate electric vehicle uptake, or, for example, weatherization of homes. And he's now going around to different agencies of government and telling them that they should be reducing budgets by 5 to 10%, as opposed to telling them they should be investing in a new energy economy. When the various academic institutions of Vermont began to close at the beginning of this year, instead of understanding that investing in human capital so that we have young people capable of engaging in sustainable agriculture, capable of engaging in renewable energy, capable of engaging in sustainable mobility, the administration decided to sit on its hands and allow that human capital to drain away. So I personally have reached the conclusion that, at least within the executive branch of government, a well-meaning governor is not the same as an effective and committed governor. And similarly, within the legislature, you would think that a supermajority of 70% of the seats in the House would be sufficient to advance this agenda, but they have not advanced this agenda. They have lacked creativity. They have lacked imagination. They have centered their attention around a carbon tax, which is politically very difficult, as opposed to thinking, for example, that 70% of the land cover of Vermont is forested, which means that is a carbon sink, which means you can generate resources and revenue from that carbon sink that can be reinvested in infrastructure and job creation, and can therefore find a politically palatable way of advancing this agenda as opposed to a politically toxic way of advancing this agenda. So my own answer to the question, does Vermont have the necessary leadership to innovate and invest, is not quite, not yet. But that means the burden falls on all of you, because it means that you have to do far much more to hold the people in office accountable for what they're doing on this issue. Okay, now we're getting to the final component, which is leading the transformation. I've been asked by many people in the room to tell you what you should do in order to put in place either a town or a regional climate strategy. And the honest answer is I cannot tell you how to do that, because every town and every region and every state and every national strategy has to be built based on an understanding of local circumstances. Not just the circumstances of how greenhouse gases are emitted, but societal circumstances, the political environment, the economic environment, and other things. So I cannot stand here tonight and tell you what should happen in Bennington County, of architecture that should be put in place as you embark on this journey. I've already talked about the need for societal consensus, so I won't dwell on that. But what I will say as a starting point is that it's really important to baseline your emissions, because every jurisdiction has a very different map in terms of its emissions profile. There are countries like France, for example, that have a lot of emissions coming from, for example, transportation. The United States, a lot of emissions coming from transportation. And then there's a country like Ireland, where I come from, where a lot of the emissions are coming from agriculture. And if you were to look at a map of the United States, you would see that state by state, the nature of emissions right across the country really varies substantially. And even within a place like Vermont, you're going to have very rural areas, very, very heavily dependent on land use, and you're going to have more urban areas where energy use and transportation is more of a factor. So you have to start by baselining. Beyond that, the second key part is benchmarking, which means reach out and understand what your peers are doing so that you can avoid their mistakes and you can learn from their best practices and you can leapfrog their experiences. So for example, when Pepsi is deciding on what climate strategy to put in place, the first thing they want to know is what is Coca-Cola doing. When MasterCard is putting in place a strategy, the first thing they want to know is what is Visa card doing. And the same thing applies to a town. You need to find out what your peers are doing because what they are doing is going to accelerate and it's going to help you avoid pitfalls. Then you have to collaborate. And collaborate means first and foremost joined up government. Many governments, whether at the state level, national level, or anything in between, fall short because they have one agency or department of government leading on this issue, usually the Department of Environment, and you have the Department of Finance dragging its feet. Or you have those responsible for the budget dragging their feet. Or you have those responsible for public procurement dragging their feet. So it's very important not only to build a societal consensus, but to have joined up government or within the context of a company, have everybody in the C-suite in the company not only on board, but advancing the agenda within their own individual mandates. But you also need to collaborate outside of government. You need to reach out to the wider community, to business owners, to make sure you understand what type of policy incentives would those business owners need in order to lead on this issue. Whenever I'm developing a strategy for companies or governments, I always use a series of criteria to prepare the strategy advice that I give. The first is, whatever you do has to be meaningful. In other words, it must leap and reach to the limit of your capabilities. There is no point in doing something that lacks ambition because you will be hit by everybody for doing that. Those who do not want you to embark on the journey will criticize you, and those who do will also criticize you because they'll say you're not serious enough about the problem. So it has to be meaningful in order to be credible. Second of all, it must be plausible. There must be a logic, there must be a theory of change, there must be confidence that what you are embarking on is something that you can achieve. So if you are in a predominantly rural area and your climate strategy is predominantly focused on energy, that isn't really plausible because it isn't going in a logical fashion to help you reach your destination. It needs to be feasible. You must be able to mobilize the knowledge, human, financial, and other resources necessary to implement the vision. Otherwise, you are setting yourself up for failure. It must be conditional, meaning put in place a strategy, make it as ambitious as you can, but also understand that your success is dependent on the support and the incentives that you can get from others. So if you are a town, getting the support from the state and from the governor is critical to your success. If you are a state, getting the support from the federal government is going to be critical to your success. And then finally, it's wrapped up in all of this. Good strategies are sequenced strategies. Don't try for too much too soon, but instead give yourself a roadmap where you can road test your approaches, learn from success, learn from failure. If you achieve your goals ahead of time, you can then accelerate. If you're struggling with your goals, you can begin to review and revise. Okay, what I want to do now is begin to give final thoughts as to what we can do as individuals so that we still have enough time for conversation. So some years ago, at the end of the Paris conference, the CSO of Nike reached out to me and said, okay, we've done this, what's next? And what I came up with was a vision for what the next generation of leadership looks like. And this is something that is applied to governments, to companies, but is also something increasingly that I recommend as being applied to individuals. And it's a framework called ACT, Enable, and Influence. ACT meaning do whatever you can within your own sphere. Do whatever you can that you yourself can control as an individual to reduce emissions and to enhance resilience. Do your best to enable others to lead as well. You are powerful agents of change. You have a community of people around you in your family, in your workplace, in the town in which you live. What are you doing to enable other people to succeed? And then finally, influence. What are you doing to influence corporate behavior? What are you doing to influence the political enabling environment? So to give you a sense of what some of that looks like, when it comes to acting, the first thing you must do is reduce your own emissions. You cannot be a credible advocate if you are not following your own advice. There's an old adage in climate change that the problem is food, fuel, and footnotes. So whatever you want to do, you must begin by addressing energy, reducing energy use, changing the energy mix that you're drawing from, which means if you can go renewable, go renewable. If you can insulate your home, insulate your home. If you can use less energy, use less energy. Second of all, transportation. As much as possible, change your transport modalities from something like a gas guzzler to public transportation, to biking, to walking. Change your pattern of consumption. Consume less and consume locally. Don't buy from Amazon, buy from the bookstore. It reduces carbon, it helps for a thriving local community. And change food systems. Food waste is an enormous contributor to global climate change, as is the nature of our diet. Now, for example, one of the things that I always say is we need to reduce our beef consumption. One of my friends in the audience will tell you we don't have to cut out beef altogether, but we certainly need to reduce the amount of beef that we eat. Because right now, around the world, we have global trends that are exacerbating each other. So we have a global population that's increasing. We have a global middle class that's increasing. More and more of that global middle class is switching from a diet based on plants and vegetables to a diet based on meat. And if you were to count livestock as its own individual country, it would be the third largest greenhouse gas emitter in the world. So, change our diet. Very important part to how we go about this journey. Now, this is a particular slide that is one of many. There are all manner of different ways to calculate your own greenhouse gases, and there are all manner of ways in which you might reduce your emissions. This is simply for illustrative purposes, but it shows you that the types of things that you can do have a very, very different impact on reducing emissions. I recently spoke at Morgan Stanley, and one person followed me out of the building to tell me how good she was on climate change because she had reduced her dependence on meat and was now vegetarian. She was only using public transportation and she had insulated her home. So she's now a climate leader. And she said, "Is there anything else I can do?" And I said, "Well, tell me how many children you have." And she said, "I have 7 children." Look at the far right of this particular graphic. So, that means that reproductive rights becomes a climate strategy. It means sex education in schools becomes a climate strategy. It means when you have women, particularly in the developing world, who don't have control over their own reproductive health, and of course there's a threat of that here too, that is not only an assault on human rights, it's also damaging to our efforts to address climate change. Become an educator is a critical part of how we go about enabling other people to lead on this issue. That in part means take what you know about this issue and speak to your neighbours. If they agree with you, form a community of action. If they disagree with you, try to find a way to reach them. One of the things that I've learned through my career is that it's important to create what I call a vocabulary of arguments, which means what excites you and interests you and motivates you might not be the same as what motivates me. What I've got to do if I want to be an advocate is I've got to find out what you care about and I've got to speak to that. I, for example, don't care about polar bears. I'm not in the climate community because of ecology. I'm in the climate community because of the way in which climate change undermines human rights, undermines opportunity, destroys livelihoods, changes mobility patterns. That's what brought me to the climate community. There are other people who came to the climate community because of national security reasons, because they were fearful of fragile states falling into disrepair and having to send US men and women into armed conflict overseas.
I think it's awesome, but a lot of people are not going to do that without an economic incentive or a reason to do it. And you also mentioned carbon tax, maybe politically very difficult. How do you feel about carbon fee and dividend? You know, this would be where a carbon fee would be levied and the money would be redistributed to everybody. I mean, I think I would love to get a check once a year for the carbon fee. And that also has bipartisan support. How do you think that would fare politically?
So I'm a great believer in carbon pricing. and there are 72 separate carbon pricing mechanisms in jurisdictions right around the world. And you can have that as a carbon tax, you can have it as an emissions trading system, you can have it as a
Fee and
fee and dividend, sorry, that you just mentioned a moment ago. You can have it in all sorts of different ways. I think fundamentally pricing pollution is very, very important. The key issue becomes, how do you design it? The second key issue becomes, can you get it passed? If you can get it passed, great. If you can't get it passed, there are many other things that you can do that can help reduce emissions and raise revenue. So all I'm saying in the context of Vermont in particular is, I would support a well-designed carbon tax. I would support an alternative way of pricing pollution, absolutely, if it can get passed. If it can't get passed, I think there are many other alternatives. Now, one of the problems that I had with the Essex plan, for example, which was tabled as one possible alternative in Vermont for carbon pricing, is that I wasn't convinced it was going to reduce emissions, because it was going to charge people for having a high emissions lifestyle, particularly the fuel that they were using, but it was going to rebate money back to those same people. So I simply wasn't convinced that it would be anything more than a pass-through financial mechanism that consequently wouldn't reduce emissions. So carbon pricing, absolutely yes, it's critical, but the devil is in the detail in terms of how you design it, I would say. And then in terms of the different steps, yes, some of these steps require economic incentives, and those economic incentives should be there. But it's not a question of new money. So there's about $490 billion annually spent on subsidies for coal and gas and oil. That money now ought to be drawn down, and it needs to be reallocated. And the same sorts of perverse incentives are given to other high carbon industries. So there is enough money in our system, in our politics, in our economy, to begin to shift the types of incentives. But there's also things that you can do that don't require economic incentives, that don't require policy. You can decide, for example, that you're going to take a few more of your trips each week by walking or biking rather than being in your car. You can decide that you're going to hang your clothes out to dry rather than put them in a dryer. You can decide, for example, that you're going to buy a hybrid rather than a gas guzzler. You can decide, for example, that you're going to give up beef. There's lots of things that you can do. Individually, maybe they're not enough, but if we all start doing it, and if we all start communicating the reasons for those decisions, then that cumulatively begins to add up. That's not to say that we don't need incentives, we absolutely do, but I just don't think we should wait for the incentives. We need to get busy now.